Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Differentiating with the Science of Reading, Supporting Multilingual and English Learners. If you're joining us for the second time today, welcome back. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to join us twice. And thank you all for joining us today. My name is Laura Almazara, and I'm on the literacy team here at Amplify. Today's webinar will be recorded, and we'll email out the recording link for you to rewatch as you like, along with the slide deck. Everyone here with us today will also receive a certificate of attendance. We have a live captioner with us today, so if you want to access the captions, click on live transcript in the bottom tray. Throughout the webinar, if you have any questions, please pop them in the Q&A and we'll try to get to them at the end. We welcome comments in the chat, and to start, let's find out where everyone is joining us from and what your role in education is. I am in normally sunny Phoenix. We've had an abnormally rainy week so far this week. We're getting some of that California weather. So we got people from all over the US and probably the world too. So thank you so much for joining us. One quick note before I pass the mic over to Kajal and Alestra. This is the second to last webinar in our incredible literacy data takeover week. We have one more tomorrow, presented by Dr. Gina Biancarosa from the University of Oregon. Hers is called Beyond K2, Data for the Upper Elementary and Middle School Grades. To find out about the other webinars in this series and watch any of these on demand and register for Gina's webinar, visit amplify.com/data takeover week. And thank you again for joining us here today. We are just so thrilled to have Amplify's own Kajal Patel Bilo and Alestra Flores Menendez here with us today. Welcome, Kajal and Alestra.
Thank you, Laura. And so I just want to show the other webinars that that Laura just mentioned. And so, yeah, jumping in. So thank you so much for being here. Alestra, my co-presenter, and we both love language. And so we wanted to kick off with this Instagram post that we saw that we both really got lost in the comments. What is a word from your language that you think is perfect that doesn't have an English equivalent? We both got lost in the comments. Would actually like for you all to answer this question and would like to get lost in your comments. I will kick it off. I'll share the word Masi. Masi is a Gujarati word. Gujarati is a language spoken in India that I grew up with. Masi refers to your mom's sister. And I actually love that there are many languages that have very specific words for how people are related to each other that English just doesn't really specify. Alestra, what about you?
So hi everyone, I'm Alestra Menendez, and thanks for the invite, Kajal, to talk about one of my favorite words of all time. Comes from the Portuguese language. So when I lived in Brazil and taught in Brazil, I learned this term saudade, and saudade is when you're feeling like a longing for something that you miss. It could be, most often it's a person. And I was able to really experience what saudades means when I left Brazil, and I left all the people that I loved and my students that I loved, and just felt this longing and this missing of my students. And like in English, notice I'm having to use multiple words in English to explain what is just with one word expressed in Portuguese.
Oh, I love that word. And someone else actually in the chat also mentioned saudade. I see guagua Dominican for bus. In ASL pa, it means something, it means like what is your thing, like something that represents you. Ahorita in Spanish. Let's see. And then I'm gonna not pronounce some of these words right because I don't know the language, but there's a word mormor in Swedish, which is your mom's mom. Ganas in Spanish. I love that one. So yeah, apapachar. And so these are some of the other favorites on the screen that we also really loved. And I think we all love our morning coffee. And the word sisu, the Finnish woman at the gym actually is always telling us sisu, so we work harder. So just a quick introduction of ourselves. I'll just let Alestra introduce herself first.
Okay, so hi everyone. Again, this is me in El Salvador, working with Salvadoran students. I am a bilingual educator. That's sort of how I started off in this world. But currently I am a biliteracy specialist at Amplify, and I'm just really excited to be here with you all.
Thank you, Alestra. And I'm Kajal Patel Bilo. I lead by literacy at Amplify, and I work across teams to across our solutions in Spanish and in service of multilingual learners. I get to work with experts in the field. I learn from and work with experts like Alestra internally. And we are both just really excited to be here with you today and talk with you about this topic that is important to all of us. And so a quick look at our agenda. We're going to first ground ourselves in who we're talking about when we're talking about multilingual and English learners and how they're being served, the role of assessment and what we need to think about when we're doing assessment, instructional strategies, and then science of reading across disciplines. So I'm going to take you through the first two sections, and then we'll turn it over to my colleague Alestra. So kicking it off with who our multilingual and English learners are. So this is a map from 2000. And at that point in time, there were about 4.5 million students classified as English learners in the US. And take a look at where they were in the country. And I'm going to advance us to 2019. And at this point, there are over 5 million, which is about 10% of the school population. And by 2025, according to the National Education Association, 1 in 4 students is going to be a multilingual and English learner. And as you can see, this is everywhere in every state. I was at a conference last year where I learned that Greensboro, North Carolina, is the place in the country with the fastest growth of multilingual and English learners, and got to actually hear from a really amazing principal of a school where she had started 2 dual language programs, one in Spanish and the other in Urdu. And that was to reflect the population of the students that her school was serving. And so we can see that there's incredible diversity there. And multilingual and English learners are not a monolith. There's incredible diversity in multilingual and English learners, starting off with language. 75% of students speak Spanish as their home language. And even within that group, there's incredible diversity based on where that Spanish comes from. And then the top 5 languages after that are the Chinese languages, Vietnamese, Arabic, Portuguese, and Haitian Creole. Would love to hear from you in the chat. What are the main languages, or what are the prominent languages other than English in your district? Because we find that it really varies based on where different groups of people are. And I'm seeing a lot of other languages here: Telugu, Bangla, Hmong, Tagalog, Ukrainians. There's so many. The chat is going so fast. Nepali. Yeah. So many. And so it's really important that be kept in mind. And all of these things that make multilingual and English learners so diverse, these are things that we have to think about, because it impacts how we support them and it impacts how we analyze data. Another important piece is the makeup of the multilingual and English learners in terms of their language profile. So this is a graphic that I borrowed from a paper by Kiefer and Thompson that we're actually going to talk about in just a moment. But the group of students in the umbrella of multilingual and English learners is very diverse, and it's really important to disaggregate when we're talking about them, because again, needs may be then different, and it impacts how we look at the supports. So we have current English learners. Within even current English learners, we have different levels of English proficiency. There are long-term English learners. We have former English learners. So these are students who are no longer classified. There are students who, and current and former together make up a group called Ever. At some point in time, they were classified as English learners. And then there's a group called Never English learners. They are multilingual learners, but they have never been classified. And while this group is small, it's important to know that they're there, right? They're made up of students who have maybe grown up simultaneous bilingual, always with English proficiency, or maybe are native English speakers and are learning in a dual language program. In addition, it's really important to think about the diversity in background and education. 85% of multilingual and English learners were born in the US. And so these are students that have grown up in bilingual or multilingual homes and have had varying levels of exposure to English and other languages. In addition to that, we have many newcomers in the country, and again, coming with different profiles in terms of background that they've had in education, their language background, whether or not their schooling was interrupted, whether or not any schooling was done in English, and so forth. So multilingual students have a gift. Multilingualism is a gift. Yet we're seeing in data that multilingual students, multilingual and English learner students, often are underperforming or have a gap. They're not, their performance is really driven by language, okay? And so it's really important to disaggregate the data. And so I want to share this data by, this is from the paper that I referred to by Kiefer and Thompson, the hidden progress of multilingual students, because sometimes we're not seeing it in the data and it looks like, it looks one way and maybe something else is happening. So I want to explain this data a little bit. So in the top row, we have a group of multilingual students. That's in the gray, that's the light gray. The middle bar is dark gray, and that is multilingual students. And as we showed in that circular diagram on the last slide, that group includes students currently classified, formerly classified, as well as never classified. And then in the bottom row, we have current English learners. They're currently classified. And so if we take a look at grade 4 NAEP data from 2003 to 2015, let's take a look at what we see. So in 2003, between monolingual students and English students classified as English learners, we had a 35-point gap. And between monolingual students and multilingual students, a 17-point gap. Now, how does that change across time? Well, when we get to 2015, 12 years later, the gap between monolingual students and English learners has persisted and even increased. So this looks like it's getting worse. But what is often not looked at is this middle bar that includes students that are formerly classified as English learners. And we can see that that gap has narrowed. And actually, if this data is looked at in later grades, if we're looking at this data in later grades, that gap even continues to narrow. So shifting gears into support for students and teachers. This data is from the Office of English Language Acquisition, and the states in dark blue are states that met or exceeded the projected need for instructors, for multilingual and English learners. And in light blue, those are states that did not meet the projected need. And the data is a few years old, and we know that things are changing. But just take a look at your state and see what that looks like. And I'm going to actually flip back to a map that we looked at earlier. And then I would love to hear your reflections in the chat based on the population of multilingual and English learners and the need for instructors. What are you seeing in your state? I see in the comments, the states with more do better. Struggles in Colorado, where the need is apparent, there are the fewest teachers. Yes, oops, wrong slide. There we go. Lots of support needed in Texas. Yes. I'm seeing a lot of comments about need. And this is really important. You know, 30%, actually, let me back up and add one more statistic that I forgot to share. 64% of teachers have at least one multilingual learner in their classroom. So that number is growing. And 30% of teachers feel prepared to teach multilingual learners. That number is low. And 80% feel that even though materials are getting better and more standards aligned, that they still feel that they can't fully rely on what they have, that they need to supplement and create some of their own to fully meet the needs of multilingual and English learners. There is momentum to change this. I think it's an exciting time to sort of be in this space. There is growth in programs, including a growth in dual language programs, which we know are effective and beneficial not only to multilingual and English learner students, but to all students. the U.S. Department of Ed has recently kicked off an initiative. Their Being Bilingual is a superpower initiative to promote multilingual education. And some statistics that I think are very exciting and promising. By 2025, 25% of districts that are currently serving Spanish-speaking students are making a shift to dual language education. By 2030, in the state of Washington, all students will have access to dual language education. And by 2040 in California, 3 out of 4 students will graduate with the seal of biliteracy. So I think that is very exciting. None of this can happen without support for teachers. And so that is going to have to be a really important part of this. But if these are the goals, then we can expect that shift in support. And assessment policies are also changing. These are just a couple of examples. We know that there are changes happening in many places. In particular, in California, SB 114 includes important language that the student's primary language must be considered. The Colorado READ Act, LEAs must actively consider the student's home language, and the state has even made available an approved Spanish screener. The research community is also coming together to ensure that this is a priority and to ensure that multilingual and English learners are served with research-based practices. In particular, the Reading League and the National Committee for Effective Literacy came together last year for alignment on this. There's a QR code available to you here because the result is this joint statement that we're going to refer to throughout. I really recommend checking out this joint statement, understanding the difference, the science of reading and implementation for English learners and emergent bilinguals. Over 20 authors and contributors were part of this, and over 220 organizations signed this. You can see just a sampling of the names here, including Dr. Kathy Escamilla, Dr. Claude Goldenberg, Dr. Martha Martinez, Wida, Seal, and many others. And as I mentioned, we're going to be sharing some of those highlights, but want to kick off with one piece, which is that there's alignment that there is research that has been conducted for decades in multiple languages that includes, and multiple studies have included multilingual and English learners and emergent bilinguals, as stated here. We also must acknowledge that more research has been done with monolingual students and that we really need to do more research that includes and centers English learners and emergent bilinguals so that we can advance our understanding. So let's talk a bit about now assessment, the role of assessment and what we need to think about when we are assessing multilingual and English learners. First, just grounding us in that assessment is a really important part of a comprehensive science of reading system, multi-tiered system of support. And the role of it is to provide information about what a student needs, where a student is in their literacy learning, so that that can inform core instruction, personalized learning, and intervention if needed. Guidance from the statement that we've referenced regarding assessment. Instruction is informed by a variety of assessments in all languages of instruction whenever possible, including teacher observations of children's progress. So let's take a closer look at some of that. It's really important to keep in mind that the assessment is information that is part of a bigger picture of information about the student. And when we're talking about multilingual and English learners, considering the English proficiency, considering the years of instruction in English are very important. It can be useful to compare students with peers that have similar levels of English proficiency or have had a similar number of years of instruction. It's also really important to consider growth over time. And we cannot forget about the importance of language. Language of instruction is important. So is the student's linguistic repertoire, the language that they are bringing from home or the multiple languages that they're bringing from home. Both of these things need to be considered. This is an example. I want to share some data that demonstrates the importance of the language of assessment. These are kindergarten students whose home language is Spanish. they were assessed using an early literacy screener. When they were assessed in English, 72% were identified as needing tier 2 or tier 3 intervention. And when they were assessed in English, sorry, did I say, I might have messed up my languages. When they were assessed in English, 72% were identified as needing tier 2 or tier 3 instruction. When they were assessed in Spanish, home language, they only 33% were identified. And so that's a big difference, and it shows the part of the picture that is missing. And this concept applies to other languages, that if we only assess a multilingual student, a student whose home language is not English, in English, that we're missing a big part of the picture. Now, fortunately, there are high quality Spanish screening assessments available. If an assessment is not available in the home language of a student, educators can talk with parents and caregivers to learn more about the student's literacy and language level. It's really a best practice to involve the parents and to get their expertise, and also to encourage continued development of the home language, because it's only going to benefit them in the language of instruction. When we're thinking about supporting children that speak languages that other than the ones that we may speak as educators, I really love this quote by Dr. Elsa Cardenas Hagen. Sometimes as teachers, we feel so overwhelmed with, well, oh, I don't know that language. How in the world am I going to introduce a whole new thing? It can seem very overwhelming. Instead, we should be starting to understand connections. And this is so important because we can do that. We don't have to learn a whole new language. We can work to understand connections. I want to share a resource that I learned about recently, and there's a QR code so you can access it yourself. It's from NYU, and it provides support to teachers for instruction and also for approved for state assessment accommodation. And it's available in over 30 languages to help make connections in a range of grades, in a range of subject areas. Just going to share a couple of little example nuggets from what's available there if you go there. But here's a glossary of Haitian Creole and English cognates. Those help make connections. Here is a resource that for academic language between English and Vietnamese. It is so important that we support the building and development of academic language for multilingual and English learners. So wanted to just share that resource. When we're looking at assessment data, it's also important to keep in mind the various language-related variables. And we've touched on some of these, but the reason I want to reiterate them is because just to drive home the point of looking at data, from different lenses, and also that more research is needed. Home language impacts the data. The amount of instruction in a specific language impacts the data. The level of language proficiency in English or in another language, the growth in 2 languages. And we are very excited. Our team has actually begun some of this study in our own data, and we are excited to share that in the future. But we're already seeing variation in the data when it comes to instructional model. So again, just another lens. The importance or the impact of language on assessment, that idea extends it is not just about a home language, but it also extends to English language variety. So we're talking about multilingual and English learners, but I want to take a little bit of a side chat to talk about English language variety, because it is a really important consideration that can sometimes be overlooked, and we want to shine a spotlight on it. There are many varieties of the English language spoken by our students. African American English, Mexican American English, Southern English, there are others. And the language of media and business and education is General American English. And when we are assessing in General American English, the assessment results are then we're going to see influences of English language varieties and, of course, of home language. So because of that, just some things that we want to remember and that we want to incorporate in our practices: accepting variation in pronunciation and accent, and never penalizing for that. using non-deficit, non-comparative, and positive language, and understanding the impact of on instruction. I see something, I just want to call out something in the chat that I like from Barbara. We all have an accent. We do. And I'll give you an example of my own in a minute. But as an example, so this is information given to a teacher in the context of some student results. The context here is that there's some students that have been grouped together because something that they have in common is that the final consonant clusters are signaled as a potential area of instructional focus. Okay. In addition to that, here we're giving teacher guidance that, okay, so this may be an area of instructional focus, but hey, we want to also point out that children who, I'll just read it, children who pronounce words like fast as fast or old as old, so differently in those consonant clusters, that might have to do with language variety. So take a moment and think about that and learn and try to learn a little bit more about that. And here's an example of going deeper. Where that type of guidance is provided on what to do next. This is a different example, not on consonant clusters, but on vowels. And this is where my husband I say pin and pin, pen. He says pen, and I say pin, very similar to pin, the word pin. I grew up in the South. And so, this is an example of where it might sound like it might be difficult to assess whether a student is rhyming. So the guidance given is maybe intentionally choose words where the sound is going to be more different, like the short A and the short E. All of this to say, be thinking about language variety and the impact of that in addition to language. So shifting back to language, want to just take a spotlight on when we have data in two languages and how we should look at that. We should look at it together. We look at it at one. We've heard many of the experts say bilingual students are not two monolinguals in one. They're bilingual or multilingual. And so when we have data in English and Spanish, this is an example, or English and another language, we want to look at it together. And so here's an example of Gabriel and a report of his assessment data. And if we were to just look at that top bar in English, we may see that Gabriel is scoring in the well below or below benchmark range. And if we were to, so that may be then what we think about Gabriel, but that's not even true. That's not the full picture. We have to add Spanish. When we look at Spanish, we can see that he's scoring in the benchmark range in these skills. And in he has phonological awareness, he has decoding, and these skills transfer. And that is important information that I want to have as an educator, because then I can support him with that transfer, and we can give educators guidance on how to facilitate that transfer. So for example, guidance given here that for phonological awareness, starting with the sounds that are similar and then moving to the sounds that are different. So I would love to pause another time here in the chat. We've talked about a bunch of different variables that need to be considered when looking at assessment. I would love to hear from you of any other variables or how these variables, what strikes you? I'm seeing a lot on accent. We need to explore what role accents play in perceptions of students in a school setting. That is very true. And how do monolingual teachers show up in the classroom to support their diverse students? Where can we access assessments in multiple languages? Yes, we can provide information on that. I mean, at Amplify, we have a screener in Spanish. I think one challenge is with multiple languages in the field. And so really connecting with the parents is a really great start to learn about their language.
I love what Jessica is saying here as well about, and I think that Erica kind of is echoing that, that asset-based approach, really starting with what students know and then building from that. So appreciate those comments.
I'm going to transition to my colleague Alestra to talk about instructional strategies for multilingual and English learner students.
Thank you, Kajal. So folks, as we are, some of the comments that I saw in the chat, we're sort of asking about this idea, like, well, what do you mean when we talk about, connections? What really is that when we're helping students make connections? So one thing, I really kind of want to land us on is from the joint statement that we did. I think we shared the link earlier on in the chat, but maybe we can share that again. Is in the joint statement. And actually, I think there was somebody here, a participant who also shared the link. So we do appreciate the camaraderie and everyone kind of sharing resources together in the chat. Is one of the things that really stood out to me when I read this was the need for comprehensive instruction. When you read the joint statement, you're going to see some sort of do's and do nots. And one of the do nots was, it's not just about isolating sounds and really kind of hitting kids over the head with phonics instruction. I mean, that I think that's one of the things that people kind of really push back against. It's like, it's all of the aspects of literacy that we really want to support students to develop. If it's that academic vocabulary, but of course, we know with English learners or multilingual students, that, even general vocabulary, we want to help develop that. The foundational skills are so key. So everyone should have access to that instruction. Students should not be pulled out of Tier 1 instruction to have some other kind of instruction and kind of miss out what everyone at their grade level is doing. So we can provide other opportunities to support, but we really want students to get that writing, that reading comprehension, all of those literacy strands. So I'm going to kind of give a few examples here. When we are helping students to make connections, we can make connections to what they already bring. And I love that asset-based approach that some of you are already sharing in the chat. For example, if I have kindergartners, sitting on the rug with me and we're reading about kings and queens, and we're learning about kings and queens, I'm going to ask my students, what do you know about kings and queens? And maybe, the students can talk about some of the stories their families have shared with them about kings or queens or emperors. And so it just makes the classroom so much richer because all students can learn together that, there are some universals. When we're building background knowledge, we really want to bring, what students know into the space. Another thing that we can do, and I loved seeing, these are just a few languages. I know there's so many more languages beautifully, listed there in the chat. But for students who are learning the sounds of English, finding out a little bit, being sort of curious about what are the languages my child, my students are speaking at home? What can I learn about them? And can I even make some connections? I speak Spanish and I speak English and Portuguese. So I could support students, in my classroom, but I've had students in my classroom from Tonga and from Korea and from Vietnam. And so asking questions about them, do you have this letter in your alphabet? What does the letter say in your alphabet? You can ask the students, you can talk to families, and we can also sort of push ourselves to learn more. So we can use resources like what you see here. This is developed by Amplify, where we're doing analyses of the sounds of the English language, kind of side by side with, for example, we see Tagalog and Cantonese, understanding why it might be difficult for some students to articulate particular sounds because they don't have that sound in their language, or why they might see a sound. For example, a student who speaks Spanish might see the letter J, and instead of making the sound ch, they might make the sound h. And understanding that when we know a little bit more about the languages that our students come with. One of the things that we always talk about in the space of helping multilingual learners is the importance of oracy, or oral language development. And oracy is, for students listening, hearing good models, like the teacher for sure is a wonderful model, showing students sort of how to articulate sounds. Where do I place my tongue, my teeth, my lips when I make a particular sound? Is it voiced? Is it unvoiced? But it's not only the teacher. We have, a wealth of other language experts in our classrooms, oftentimes, those native English speakers who can also model and demonstrate language. And as students are working together, they can be working through problems together. So they're building their background knowledge at the same time that they're building their language. And as we're asking our students to, go from the listening to the speaking, we can provide them with scaffolds for oral responses. It could be something like, I'm going to say it first, now say it with me, or I'm going to give you a sentence frame and I'm going to model it first. And then I'm going to choose a native English speaker to model after me. And now we're going to invite our multilingual students. So these are strategies that we can use to help students to really enter into the classroom, demonstrate those assets they bring. What you see here, folks, is something that we really feel strongly about is, the students being in that tier 1 classroom so that they get that exposure, so they can participate in those rich grade level discussions, even if the child is mostly listening and maybe needs some sentence frames to provide oral responses. We still would want them to be exposed to that robust, vocabulary instruction, or listening to complex sentence structures, or reading beautiful poetry. But there is a time where and I know there are different names for this. Some folks say sheltered English instruction, or push-in or pull-out EL services, or support for multilingual learners. That time in the day where you can take a small group of students, maybe they all speak the same language at home, maybe you have 4 or 5 different languages, represented there at your table, and you, the teacher, are going to provide some support. But what we're seeing here is this is one-to-one correspondence between what is that student doing in their English language development time of the day that is connected to what they learned or will learn in their core instruction. So I'll give you a concrete example. In this particular unit, let's say students are going to be working with this idea. These are second graders. They're working with this idea of, what's the theme of the story? How these characters behave, how does that lend to the theme of the story? Well, if I have language, students who are learning English as their second language, there's a lot there. There's a lot of cognitive demand. There's a lot of language demand. So what I'm going to do as the teacher is I'm going to say, okay, well, let's talk about characters in general. My students understand what a character is? And how do we describe a character? We can describe the way a character behaves. We can introduce students to some, describing words. Oh, the character was friendly. The character liked to share. The character liked to do these things. Then when they go to their core instruction, they can build upon that. They're listening to their peers talk about how, a character who was friendly was showing friendship by sharing with another character. And that leads to the theme of friendship or loyalty. This friend, whenever their friend, was hurt, they were helping their friend. They were always there for their friend. Oh, and so now students can make that connection. We talked about that. We talked about how some characters can very much, be friendly or be helpful. And so they can make those connections when they get into the core instruction. So this opportunity to preview information with that ELD, or maybe even after that theme lesson, do some review. What are some of the things we talked about? What are some of the themes we discussed? And how do we connect to the way the behaviors of the character led to that theme? Another thing that we all, in this, I know I'm talking to folks who are in this work. Another thing that we really highlight in the multilingual space is that importance of vocabulary, explicit vocabulary instruction. And so what you see here is a routine that's developed by Beck and McEwen, where for the learners, we would want to have some very kind of step-by-step guidance for how to really deeply understand a word. As we know, words are concepts. And in this particular example, students have been introduced in context to this word spectators. Spectators, in this example, are inventors moved around as the athletes prepared. So let's ask our students, okay, let's say that word, let them form the word in their mouths. Spectators, modeling it, for the students. And then having the students, maybe a couple of times, spectators, break it into syllables, spectators. And then giving them a student-friendly definition. Well, spectators are people who watch an event. And this is a great time to also use maybe some illustrations or some photographs. Oh, these are the spectators. They're watching this sports event. And I could say, oh, there's another example. Spectators waited for the game to begin. Have you ever been a spectator? Now let me turn it over to my students. Now that we've had some opportunities to grapple with this word spectators, they're able to connect it to their own lives, their own experiences. And I welcome everyone here to ask students, how would you say that in your language? Because it shows that you are valuing the language that they come with, realizing that they have assets, that they have knowledge about this topic. It's just that we're supporting them to bridge that to their, to the English language. So this is one of the ways that we can support vocabulary is through really explicit instruction. And we talked a little bit earlier about, having that comprehensive, coming from the joint statement, comprehensive literacy instruction. And part of that is that importance of students understanding, the code of the English language. What are the, the sounds of the English language? How are these sounds produced when we combine them in particular ways, like these two vowels? What are the sounds, with the sound that we would hear when these two vowels are together in a sound spelling combination? So the way that we do this, is through decodable text. And I'll go ahead and define a little bit what I mean when I say decodable text. Decodable text meaning the student has been introduced explicitly and systematically to every single sound and sound spelling combination that they see in the text. So here, we are really promoting that these texts are meaningful. I know when I was a first grade teacher and I would give a student a book and the entire book was, things like the cat was fat and sat on the mat. And it's kind of like, okay, that fell flat. Because there wasn't much meat there, right? To discuss, to think about. Here we see a decodable where there's a lovely child. These are CVC patterns, very simple, skills like early kindergarten. But this Kit is going to go on many adventures, and we get to follow Kit along through all of these chapters. Kit has a friend Stan. Kit has lots of hats. Kit has lots of cats. One of the cats gets stuck in a tree, so we've got to go ask our friend, to come and help with the cat. So by giving students kind of ideas and story structures, even when they're reading the decodables, they can make meaning from text, and that is so key, not only for multilingual students, but for all students. So one other thing that I think can be really challenging for students who speak a language other than English is understanding the structure of language, because it might be very different from the language they speak at home. Does the verb precede the adjective, or does the adjective precede the verb? So we want to show students sort of very explicitly, this is how, the sentence is formed in English. Classifying what kind of verb are we talking about, a linking verb, or are we talking about an action verb? And interesting, you might find once you kind of start doing that uncovering, is that some of the languages have very similar structures. So there are linking verbs and action verbs in Spanish as well. And so, really bringing that to light for students so they can make those connections. Now, I want to end sort of this idea of, what are some strategies we can use instructionally by really thinking about, and Kajal, I really appreciate how you brought this up earlier, that it's not the students, the multilingual students, it's not a homogenous group. We have students who are very new to the English language, maybe newly arrived to the country, maybe just entering kindergarten and it's their first exposure to English. We also have students who have actually been really working on their English proficiency for longer periods of time. So we want to be able to distinguish, okay, what would I expect realistically for where this child is? What would they be able to process? What could I expect? If I'm talking to the child or reading to the child, what would I expect them to understand? And at their level, what would I expect them to produce? So what you see here is we might have some students who are very early, they're just entering or they're just emerging in their English proficiency. But you'll have other students. I was just working with the district recently who was saying, oh yeah, because we've got some students and they're going to take their access assessment and they're going to be exited and not receive multilingual services anymore. And we know this is the case. Sometimes the scaffolds can fall away when students have shown their proficiency. And that's what we hope to do, to support students so they do get to that point. So what I'd like to start talking about now, because we've really been honing in and focusing on the science of reading specific to literacy instruction. But I really encourage everyone here to kind of put on your thinking cap and think about all of the other content areas that you teach. Maybe you're even a single subject educator and you might teach math or you might teach science. So I'd love to talk about the science of reading across multiple disciplines. And this is true for any domain that students are learning, whether math or science, social studies. We know that there are opportunities to really help students develop their receptive language by listening and reading. Students are taking in and processing language. But there's also opportunities in the content areas to really help students express themselves through, orally, just having conversations with their peers or, raising their hand and calling out for the class, or through writing. Maybe that's sort of where they they're either rehearsing what they're going to write about, or maybe they're writing first before they're going to feel ready to share out orally. So we can provide students these opportunities. What is really important and what I love about the Amplify Desmos math team, one of their sort of principles is they say we really want to increase access for multilingual learners. We want to eliminate barriers, but very importantly, everyone, we do not want to reduce the demand of the task. This is about language development, and we want to keep kids at the edge of their learning, no matter what language they speak most strongly at home. All of our students really deserve, to be challenged at the edge of their learning. And so what you saw there was a student to student. Actually, let me go back because I want to point something out. One of the ways we can do this, for example, is maybe the two students here in the front, maybe they're having a conversation in English. Maybe, they read a text together and now they're having sort of a little debate. The two gentlemen in the back there, maybe what they're doing is they're actually having that same debate, but the teacher has welcomed them. If they would like to have this debate in their first language, then they can go ahead and talk about the story that was read and discussed in English, but they can now talk about it in their first language. Then when everybody shares out, they can connect their discussion to what their other classmates in their table group were talking about. So that's kind of one of the things we talk about. And, let's eliminate those barriers and let's make sure to keep that, that task demanding so our students are growing. Another thing that we really emphasize at Amplify is multimodal instruction. And so what you're seeing here is an example of our science curriculum where we have a learning framework. Basically, I'm just going to read it out loud. It's the do, talk, read, write, visualize strategies. But students being able to engage with science ideas across multiple modalities. So they might be doing hands-on experiments, which is so wonderful for language learning because students have concrete realia. They are making observations. They are excited to talk about what they're observing, and they're listening to their peers sharing out, the same observation, but maybe modeling that English language. They are going to maybe be having some discussion about, well, do you think that this is what is happening in this process? Or do you think this is what's happening? So, just a little bit of a productive struggle there through conversations. And maybe we're kind of going to have to use some evidence to back up like my idea. Students reading science texts or math texts or social studies texts, you name it, literature. This is going to give students that academic vocabulary, those academic sentence structures. So we really want them to be engaging with reading and writing as a reciprocal process. We know that these go together. So in science, in math, they're reading and they're writing and they're connected. And this might be new for some of you folks out there, but probably something you could relate to. I think all of us, some of us, we say, well, I'm a visual learner, but a lot of the curricular areas, they lend themselves to that. For example, using a simulation to explore a phenomenon in science, or in math, watching a graphing function like happen before your eyes can really support student sense making when they can visualize things or even create mental models. We invite them to sort of, okay, well, how would you visualize this happening? So the do, talk, read, write, visualize model can be supportive, of course, in science, but I invite you to stretch yourself to think about, how this can also maybe work in other curricular areas. I'm going to share with you a math idea that I love, that the math program that we have has actually language routines. So these are math language routines that are so supportive of our multilingual learners. So if you think about this idea of how can I make my ideas stronger and clearer, this is something that students are going to do their whole academic career. So notice that we've given students some time to process. Step one, go ahead and think about what your ideas are with this, related to this problem. Which of these two will have a darker blue? Take some time and just like give them some think time. Let them draw, let them label. This is a really nice low floor activity, but we want to take them to a high ceiling, right? So let's do that through support. This next step, we're going to have them talk to a partner. What do you think? Let's give them the sentence frames to guide that conversation. And let's let them talk with multiple partners. A lot of times and I'm guilty of this when I was, working with my multilingual students of, I would always put, my two students who spoke Korean were always partnered up. I wish that I had not done that so much, because by my student Hope going to meet with other students instead of always being with Robert, she would have been able to hear other ideas and other models of language. So let's let them have this conversation multiple times. And finally, after they've had that opportunity, now let's let them kind of take those ideas that they've gathered and commit it to writing, and let them write multiple drafts. So I'm going to play sort of a demonstration of what you can see when we think about developing language in the content areas. This is a science classroom, and I'm going to just let this young man kind of demonstrate his own understanding of the language of science.
I think that it could be ceramic and cement. People we need to like compact together to make each sedimentary rock.
One of the ways that we use the vocabulary cards and the key concept cards is to just allow students to make connections.
It's connected with evidence. So like evidence supports your claims.
So I had to find a way where the vocabulary card was constantly being used, and they were having to find ways to think about how that first vocabulary card connected to the one that we learned in chapter 3, which was, a month later down the road. I post them all on the board, and then probably about once every week and a half, we sit by the board and we just have a discussion about which words connect to each other. And so it allows students to think about that word from chapter 1, how it connects to the word from chapter 3. With that key concept, well, which words on my vocabulary wall are actually in the key concept, and what do those words mean when they're phrased in that sentence?
Evidence and inference, because whenever we're going to like make an inference, we must have some evidence to support it.
It's allowing the students to explore the concepts in a different way than they would in an experiment or in a different kind of discussion. And just because I teach English language learners, allows them to just play with that vocabulary in a really safe way.
I love how he said in a really safe way. Like, we want to make it a safe environment for the students. So I applaud him for that. What you see here now is this kind of teaching. He mentioned, this like we're just connecting, sort of like, how does this word connect to other words? There's lots of different kinds of conversations he was having in his classroom. But when we talked about that do, talk, read, write, visualize, what you see here is two groups. Some of the students in these classrooms, they were using the do, talk, read, write, visualize strategy in their science instruction. And there was another group of students that was not. They were kind of doing business as usual, open up the textbook, read a passage, answer some questions, maybe do some hands-on investigations. But it wasn't, that comprehensive cycle. And what we saw was, this comes from out of UCLA, the CREST study, is that the students using, all of the students in the classroom, the students who were using that multimodal approach, they outperformed on an end of unit assessment. They outperformed their peers who were in kind of business as usual classrooms with reading comprehension. Now, mind you, this is a science classroom, with science vocabulary, and with also science content knowledge. So they grew not only in science, but they also grew in their language and literacy. And this is for all of the children in that classroom, but let's take a look at for the multilingual learners in that classroom. The students who were in the Do, Talk, Read, Write, Visualize and identified as multilingual learners, they far surpassed the other students who were language learners, kind of just being given that textbook or maybe, some hands-on experiments. So I think this is really poignant. Like for me, when I saw this, it really hit home that we need to give them multiple modalities, multiple opportunities to grapple with the same idea, but in different ways, because their reading comprehension, vocabulary, and content knowledge will grow. So we are coming to the end of our webinar. We've been really, Kaj and I have been really looking forward to this. Been so excited to join you all, and we want to leave you with some great resources. So pull out the phones and feel free to, capture all of these resources that we have here. I'm going to go ahead and turn the floor over to see if there's anybody on Kajal, Laura, who wants to make some last comments before we do wrap.
Yes, thank you, Alestra. If you go to the next slide, also, we want to highlight some specific episodes of our Science of Reading podcast. You can follow that using your phone. You can follow that QR code to a playlist. And I just want to highlight, all of these episodes are great. They all have to do with biliteracy, multilingual learners, but I want to highlight one on language variety by Jasmine Rogers. I meant to mention that earlier, season 6, episode 12. The deck, these slides will be sent to everyone, so you'll have access to these, to all this information that was shared, as well as the codes to the resources.
Hopefully everyone got those QR codes. This is, this our in our last minute, just want to thank everyone. Thank you for your presence and your engagement and the wonderful questions and comments you placed in the chat. We will be sharing this with everyone. So we wish you a wonderful rest of your day. If you're going back into your classroom, have a great class, and try some of the strategies you learned today.
Thank you all so much for joining us today. And a huge big thank you to Alestra and Kajal. This was just a powerhouse, incredible presentation. There was incredible engagement in the chat. You guys had so many questions, and I really apologize that we won't be able to address them now, but we'll follow up directly via email. And just a quick reminder, we have one more webinar before we close out this literacy data takeover week. So please be sure to join us tomorrow to hear about screening in upper elementary and middle school grades. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, everyone.